Mandela went to prison because he opposed South Africa's apartheid laws. The meaning separation in Afrikaans, apartheid was a brutal system of racial segregation that ruled South Africa for nearly 50 years, dividing the population into 4 racial categories and stripping the black majority of their basic rights. We'll break down the laws that created this oppressive regime, from the ban on interracial marriages to the cruel Group Areas Act, which forced millions of people to leave their homes. Apartheid, a word that carries the weight of an era. In Afrikaans, the language of the Dutch settlers in South Africa, it simply means apartness. But for millions of people, this word represented much more than a technical term. It was the justification for the most cruel and systematic segregation the world has ever seen. Apartheid was the law that dictated where you could live, who you could marry, and what your place in society was. All based on a single, arbitrary measure: the color of your skin. This is the story of how a country divided itself in the name of racial supremacy, and how, amidst this darkness, the courage and resistance of a people brought the light of hope. The seed of segregation in South Africa didn't grow out of nothing. It was planted by centuries of colonialism and by a mindset of superiority that took deep root in society. The British settlers, and later the descendants of the Dutch, known as Boers, had already established a system of discrimination. But it was in 1948 that this system was formalized and became an unshakable state policy. In that year, the National Party, a predominantly white ultranationalist and conservative political force, came to power with a central promise in its platform: the total implementation of apartheid. They wasted no time. A series of laws was quickly passed, forming the backbone of a regime that would control the life of every non-white individual with chilling precision. The first and perhaps most symbolic of these laws was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, which, as the name suggests, made it illegal for people of different racial groups to marry. This was followed by the Population Registration Act, which rigidly classified every South African into one of 4 categories: white, European, black colored people of mixed race, and Indian, Asian. This classification was not just for census purposes. It defined your destiny, your opportunities, and your rights or lack thereof. The law that had the greatest impact on people's lives, however, was the Group Areas Act of 1950. Based on racial classification, this law designated specific geographical areas for each group. The result was social cleansing on a massive scale. Families were forcibly evicted from their homes and communities, losing their businesses, their memories, and their social ties. Vibrant neighborhoods where people of different races coexisted, like Safetown in Johannesburg, were simply demolished to make way for white neighborhoods, while their former residents were relocated to townships, vast, overcrowded shantytowns on the outskirts of cities. But the control did not stop at neighborhood borders. It followed every person. The past laws required non-whites, particularly blacks, to carry an identification document at all times. This small booklet, the passbook, was your fate. It authorized or prohibited entry into urban areas, controlled your employment, and monitored your movements. A black person found without their pass in the wrong area was immediately arrested. Thousands were incarcerated for this offense, turning the lives of millions into a constant nightmare of surveillance and fear. Education, which should be a means of social advancement, was used as a tool of oppression. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 is one of the most brutal examples of the apartheid philosophy. The Minister of Education at the time, Hendrik Forbert, himself declared that there is no place for the black man above certain levels of labor. Education for blacks was deliberately inferior, focused on preparing them for manual labor and domestic service, ensuring they could never compete with whites for positions of power or influence. While white schools enjoyed the best resources, teachers, and facilities, schools for blacks operated on minimal budgets, had poor infrastructure, and used curricula that deliberately limited their potential. Life under apartheid was a daily routine of humiliations and invisible and often visible barriers. On buses, sections for whites were separated from sections for non-whites by signs, and non-whites were often forced to stand even with empty seats in the front. In hospitals, services were segregated by race, with white hospitals equipped with the best facilities, while hospitals for non-whites often lacked basic infrastructure. Beaches, parks, cinemas, libraries, and even drinking fountains were marked with signs explicitly stating the segregation. Apartheid also created the so-called Bantustans, or homelands. The government declared that black people were not citizens of South Africa, but rather citizens of 10 independent, self-governing nations that were, in fact, small and scattered pieces of land without infrastructure or resources. This was a political maneuver to justify stripping blacks of their political rights in the country and to keep the white minority in total control. But despite all the state's power and brutality, apartheid never managed to extinguish the flame of resistance. The South African people, led by movements like the African National Congress ANC, fought tirelessly against the oppression. The resistance began with peaceful protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience. But the government's response was always the same: violence and repression. The turning point came on March 21, 1960, at the Sharpeville massacre. Peaceful protesters gathered to demonstrate against the passed laws, handing over their passes to the police as an act of defiance. The police opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 69 people and wounding more than 180. This massacre shocked the world and marked the beginning of the ANC shift to armed struggle. The fight continued, and another spark of resistance ignited the country in 1976. Thousands of students from the Soweto township rose up in protest against the imposition of the Afrikaans language in schools. The police response was brutal, killing and wounding hundreds of children and teenagers. The Soweto uprising became a symbol of the struggle against educational oppression and a crucial turning point, showing the entire world that the regime was so brutal that even children were targets. The resistance had unforgettable faces. Nelson Mandela, the leader who spent 27 years in prison for his fight against apartheid, became a global symbol of hope and perseverance. Steve Biko, the charismatic leader of the Black consciousness movement, inspired a generation to reject imposed inferiority and embrace their identity in history. His death in police custody in 1977 only strengthened the resolve of activists. Desmond Tutu, an Anglican archbishop, used his religious and moral platform to denounce the injustice, becoming a powerful voice on the international stage and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Pressure on the apartheid regime was growing from all sides. Internal resistance was increasingly strong, with strikes, protests, and boycotts. The international community also mobilized, imposing economic sanctions, boycotting South African products, and banning the country from sporting and cultural events. South Africa became a global pariah, the economy was in crisis, and internal and external political pressure became unsustainable. The wall of apartheid began to crumble. On February 2, 1990, then-President F.W. de Klerk, in a historic speech, announced the unconditional release of Nelson Mandela. The moment of his walk out of prison, with his fist raised to the crowd, is one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. Apartheid was in its final days. The following years, the segregation laws were repealed one by one, and the country prepared for its greatest challenge, the transition to democracy. In 1994, history was made. South Africa held its first multiracial and democratic elections, and the man who had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars was elected the country's first black president. Nelson Mandela's election was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament that hope can prevail over hatred. The end of apartheid was a milestone, but its legacy continues to echo in today's South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created to investigate the crimes of apartheid, sought to promote healing and justice. But the nation still faces deep economic and social inequalities. The scars of apartheid have not fully healed, and the struggle for a truly equal and just society continues. The story of apartheid teaches us a crucial lesson, that injustice and prejudice can manifest in devastating ways, but that the resilience, courage, and unity of the human spirit are forces capable of tearing down even the highest walls of oppression. It is a reminder that freedom is not a gift, but an achievement, and that the vigilance and struggle for dignity and equality must be constant in all parts of the world.